Here's the first question. I work at a scientific R&D group who claim the objectivity of transgenderism isn't to be queried. I'm looking at you, Wendy. If the science can't be queried, how do we proclaim truth?
So I'm not a scientist, so I'll probably hand it to Elizabeth, but I would just say there is no science proving transgenderism. Yep.
So again, you're dealing with a problem of different meanings being attributed to the same word. So if you listen to postmodernists, they'll say, well, science is just another way of knowing, isn't it? So this has got nothing to do with any of the scientific principles that the rest of us would think of being, repeatable, for example. That's just one basic way that you can see that a scientific principle is valid because it happens here and it happens over here. So basically, if you think a science is another way of knowing, well then your truth is as good as my truth, and the way you interpret this. So actually, no, I won't go into that whole conversation, but it's a lot of people are claiming scientific authority for things that are just not scientific because they don't meet the standards of objectivity that we normally associate with something that is can be validated through repetition and experiment. And this is actually the basis of Western civilization. It really annoys me because this is what universities are supposed to be for, and people who stand next to scientific research which is bogus should be handed out of the academy and their academic careers should be ruined. But instead, what happens is they get research awards and suddenly their bogus research becomes truth. And they think, well, that's fantastic, isn't it, because it's science. But it doesn't make it true just because you give it an award and stick a label on it. It's still not science.
We'll go on straight to the next question from Karina. What is ACL's plan to lobby MPs on enacting a Religious Freedom Act and not a Religious Discrimination Act? I think there's a deliberate intent to clarify the difference between Religious Freedom Act and Religious Discrimination Act.
Yeah, good question. The first strategy is to make sure that if a Religious Discrimination Act does pass, that it's a discrimination act mostly in name, less in substance. So we're engaging at the moment with that process. There's no doubt whatsoever that in the perfect world, we don't really want this mechanism. We'd prefer something different. Unfortunately, it looks like, and I'm the last person to admit this, we usually are the people who are, the louder voices for things and don't lie down easily. But unfortunately, right now, there is absolutely no prospect of a Religious Freedom Act, none. If you raise that with the Attorney General or the Prime Minister, they will say, shut up and go away, we're not listening to you. Now, that's because the idea of a Religious Discrimination Act has been so entrenched in the political discourse for so long. And that came out of the Ruddock Review. It's been going since basically same-sex marriage. And so the effort now is to make sure that that Religious Discrimination Act contains some bolt-ons to it that make it much better. And that's exactly what we're doing. It's actually extremely important and could end up being extremely helpful, actually a meaningful reform that could clarify, for example, the rights of Christian schools and charities and other entities to hire staff who share their values or to teach their values internally. That could be in there. For example, you could get protection not just for individuals like Israel Folau, but entities as well that get discriminated against, like churches who they can't hire a hall and all this kind of stuff. You can get that kind of protection too. Things like protection of conscience, etc. So we're including all of that, but you can be sure of this, that's only phase one. We're not lying down on the idea of further religious freedom reform beyond this. And in fact, the campaign movement that we are building should ensure that next election and it becomes a policy issue and we continue to keep up the pressure. Because we have an opportunity now under this government that we could never have imagined that we have. And I think the conversation is not over and we're not letting it go. We will see further reforms on this. There'll be round 2 and round 3. And interestingly, there is actually a round 2 planned. So we're not barking up a tree here. We're just playing in with the realities, but directing it towards a good end. So things are going well.
Can I add a further question in this domain? Are there dangers, asks Robert, in legislation on religious freedom? Will it be a double-edged sword?
Yeah, there are some things that are hard to overcome. There's risks. There's absolutely no doubt, and it has to be. We're doing a calculus essentially of, well, what are the risks? It's a little bit like, you think of something like free speech, and people are always saying, but if you have free speech, people's feelings will be hurt. But you say, no, that's a risk that we run because the value of the thing is so great. And the same with religious freedom. There are risks that we run, but then there's the value of the thing which we're trying to achieve, and our job is to minimise the risks. One way that you do minimise the risks is that religious freedom legislation, religious discrimination legislation, it cannot overwhelm, say, criminal law. It cannot overwhelm things that are clear in the legal framework of this country. So if you think of practices that we'd all be concerned about, like child marriage, polygamy, things like this, they won't be justified on religious freedom grounds because they are illegal according to Australian law specifically. And so that's not going to happen. So the kind of risk we run are much more subtle, a little bit more out of sight, and a little bit more, a little bit rarer. And we are aware of some of those, but we think that we're able to get a form of wording, and we think that we're able to pursue a reform that accounts for most of them. And I would say this, the politicians involved in this are against us on things and with us on things, and they would be with us on this. They wouldn't want to go too far. So that's again something I would say, be alert, not alarmed.
Okay. How do we reconcile freedom of Christian schools, asks Anonymous. He's been working really hard today, Anonymous. How do we reconcile freedom of Christian schools to choose who they hire with Rugby Australia choosing who they hire? How can we argue for one and not the other?
I think that's me again. Unless someone else wants to chip in. Easily, and easily because we're not asking for an arbitrary right to fire people who don't agree with you. That's not what's going on here. We're not saying that the Christian tennis club should be able to fire a coach because they went to the synagogue, or that a Christian mechanic should be able to fire his apprentice because he read the Quran in his lunch break. That's not what's going on. What we're saying is that there are certain types of organisations, types of entities which are well recognised, well defined and have been with us forever, which are ethos-based. Their whole purpose relies upon them upholding a particular ethos. So for example, a church, obviously, they cannot teach the tenets of the faith without that ethos shaping everything they do. We recognise as well Christian schools. What are they trying to do? They're trying to educate young men and women and form in them Christian character, Christian values. You can't do that in a secularised institution. You have to have a Christian institution to do it. Because their whole purpose is so, an ethos is so essential to their very purpose, then we say that the right is legitimate. And it would go for political parties as well, and it would go, for example, for an LGBT rights activist group. They want to make sure that their people are kind of on their page, right? So there are groups like that this applies to. But Rugby Australia is not promoting the tenets of atheism through the playing of sport. So they don't get the right, and neither do many organisations for which they have no business entering into people's private religious practice.
This may be a question for others. It's from Anonymous again. Does ACL believe we can soon repeal the so-called same-sex marriage laws? Since same-sex marriage can't exist, we're operating in a post-reality world which can't be good. I'll take that last bit as a comment, but what's involved in repealing a law?
I want everyone to note that I gave the opportunity. Look, short answer, no. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Some really serious change would have to be seen in Australian society to see that change. I'm not saying don't pray for it. I'm not saying we don't have it in the back of our mind at all times. But I would suggest that right now, the political realities, thinking just with what we're faced with, that's a long thing. And here's the thing. In the 1960s, a group of people did get together and they did articulate a vision for society, and they did go away and get busy, and they went underground. They just went quiet. They got into institutions. They got into places that, where they could, have influence and power, and they pushed their ideas. And they were very, very successful over many years because partly, a lot of people were asleep and didn't really expect it to happen. And I do feel as though we're a little bit at that point now. We accept that we're becoming a minority. That's fine. But what does it mean? It means we just start getting strategic. We start thinking about, okay, how do we be salt and light in this new paradigm? We start looking at ourselves and saying, what can we do? Because they actually decided that they would all become activists. They'd all start speaking up and getting up and doing things. And they did that as a tiny group, and their group just slowly got bigger. And they did that when they got 1% of what they were looking for, 1%, or 0.5% or less, and they just kept going. They had zeal. And I do think, for those of us who have the gospel itself driving us and the words of Christ to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth, we should have zeal too. And I think this is an opportunity for us to do the same thing, just to regroup, say, okay, we dropped the ball, things are getting bad, how can we do what Christ would have us to do in our current position? So that won't look like same-sex marriage getting repealed tomorrow unless God performs a miracle, and I do believe in miracles, but more likely it'll be a longer journey. But hey, let's get involved in the longer journey.
Excellent. This one from Rochelle. How do we know what facts, research to believe when our public discourse is infected with so much misinformation, injected with so much misinformation? Please recommend sources. Not tomato sauce.
The truth of it.
What kind of sauce? Hollandaise.
It's true that it's very disconcerting when things that are held up as authoritative actually don't hold water. But in some ways, the rules now are just the same as they always have been, which is read critically. And I'm shocked, actually, at some of the people that I was at university with. They did arts degrees, and the questions that you should always be playing in your head is, who is speaking to me? What do they think? What do they want me to think? And where is the evidence, and do I believe it? And does it stack up? Now, the problem is that there are so many different debates and we can't be experts in all of them. So that's why I've really focused on gender and sexuality, because I would rather get into one thing and understand it thoroughly than to just skim across the surface. Because when you're skimming across the surface, and particularly in this sort of soundbite age, we have 2 minutes to understand something, so we just understand the single causation narrative. So the sources will depend on, for each particular subject, you'll find out where are the reputable sources. The survey that I mentioned in the US surveillance summaries, I actually think that's quite funny, because here, when the activists wanted to provide evidence for the stigma narrative, they cooked up their own questions, they checked them with the activists, are these going to give us the right answers? And then they went and they tailored the survey to give them the responses that they wanted. But in America, they already had a very good, rigorous survey. They didn't have an excuse to reinvent the wheel, so they just added the LGBT question to a survey that was already there, which means that they then have to just read selectively the evidence. So if you go back through and you look at the evidence that they ignored, then that's actually telling the fact that they ignored that evidence. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating at the end was all of the children that are not having sex are scoring better on all of the other health indices. Well, this is a survey about student health. So I would have thought that would be quite an interesting thing, but it did not get a comment. So correlation is not causation. What do we understand? Do we think that kids who have sex are made unhappy by it, or that happy kids don't feel they need to have sex before the age of 17? But either way, that should be a fascinating thing. So in some ways, you get different cases as well. You sort of get to understand who you're reading. You're either reading a committed ideologue who is just going to give you complete waffle, or you're reading someone who's been influenced by the cultish mentality and they're trying to make the sources fit with the narrative. So you'll see all sorts of different levels of discomfort. But my recommendation would just be decide what you want to find out about and dig deeply into that and have a look at the primary source evidence. This is one of the things that researchers need to do, just go straight back to the facts and let them speak to you. Don't go in there with an agenda saying, I want to prove my hypothesis. Really good scholarship takes a lot of time, but it just means that you look at the sources and you let them speak to you. You let the arguments rise out of the evidence that's there.
ACL are aware of this issue as well, and we had a meeting just this last few days saying that we really need to develop some short, well-referenced resources. So keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime too, Martin does The Truth of It, a podcast that I really recommend you look at that too. And these are all, again, really, if you do your fact-checking, you won't find that it comes up short. So these are good resources. But we are working on some short booklet sort of series on different resources for some of these questions as well.
And I just thought that I'd add that, you know, as Christians, all wisdom comes from God. And one of the things that I've been praying about for a long time repeatedly is that He would give me wisdom. And not just wisdom, but what I believe wisdom to be, which is in every situation being able to discern good from evil, right from wrong. And so I would add to what's been said by just saying, look at the facts, check the sources, look at the resources that you can, and then pray for wisdom.
And if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously, and you'll receive it. It's a promise.
That's good.
Bindi, while you have the microphone, one more here for you. Have you considered moving away from the Patreon platform, as it's now deemed to be anti-conservative?
I have. I haven't had the time to. I've signed up for Jordan Peterson's Think Spot. Yes, and I'm waiting for that to be launched, and I will join that. But in the meantime, yes, I'm aware of the issues with Patreon at the moment. But don't let that stop you.
Excellent. Yes. A good point, that last one. Neville asks, how can Christian formation processes within churches and theological colleges equip us better for cultural and civic engagement? It's almost an advertisement for the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, I would have thought.
I didn't actually mean to answer the question, but because I made a gesture. I think that it is up to churches and theological colleges to make their decisions about this stuff. But I do think that as people become more concerned about it, so that appetite will be fed. I think we live in a time increasingly where things are less hierarchical. It used to be that you could go to institutions and you get a whole lot of people. You actually now have to go to people and you get their institutions. That's why we're a grassroots movement of individuals from right across the body of Christ throughout the country. That's really how it works. So I would say that all of you could have opportunities in this area to suggest it, to think about it. And I would say this, since I took this role, there's been a timeliness to it in the sense that there's a lot of churches, theological colleges, Christian schools, all sorts, who are starting to say there's a hunger for knowledge in this area. And particularly for schools and that who know their young people are looking at Jordan Peterson, are looking at Ben Shapiro, are looking, and they're saying, where's an authentic Christian voice into this area? And it just so happens they start suddenly to think of people like ACL. And they'll ring up and say, could you come and speak? Could you do? There's opportunity there, but it's driven by their sense of appetite. It's driven by their realisation that there's a need. I very often go to churches and speak, and people say, you know, this is great, really loved it. And I say, well, do you not get this stuff in sermons and things usually? They'll say, no. I'll say, but is it not in the forefront of your mind every day? And they'll say, yes. And there's a communication issue there. I think there's a role for us all to play. As I said, it's the grassroots, it's us, and we can change things. And the opportunity's there, and as Alistair said, if you know young people, get them to come to GPS, which is an 8-day program in the school holidays for school leavers, for those contemplating university or at university. It's a university proofing course. It tells them the sorts of things they'll encounter at university, helps them to think biblically, Christianly about them. The lecturers are wonderful people who care about the students, and we get high quality, you wouldn't believe, high quality young people in that age bracket coming along all the time. They'll make friends that are going to be good for them. Just encourage them to come. And then, of course, for university graduates, there's a long-form 3-monther with LMI. So bear those things in mind so that there's more people who are getting clarified thinking on this stuff. Oh, and the Church Leaders Program as well. So every year in every capital city, we tend to run a Church Leaders Program. And that's a really crucial 2-day program with, again, the same ridiculously switched on people doing the teaching, helping church leaders to think about some of these cultural issues. What I say is they've got timeless truth, and it needs to be proclaimed in a changing world, in a new context. And that's what we try and help them with.
Thank you. Quick interlude. sli.do. If you have a mobile phone and you don't feel motivated to ask a question, you can see some of the questions that I'm queuing up ahead of time. You can up and down vote those. And as you do, they disappear momentarily from my view, and it throws me. So if you want to see me completely thrown, up and down vote these questions. So that's the first fun of it. The second fun of it is I get an idea of the kind of questions that matter most to us as an audience. So I'm just putting that out there. If you don't have a question, you may want to up and down vote other questions. Meanwhile, Andrew asks a question which I don't think is meant to be taken frivolously. As Christians, we're busy with church and family. See, just moved. How do we balance adding political engagement in?
I think we're privileged, certainly I'm privileged, Martin, Wendy and I, and Elizabeth, we're privileged to do this as our day job. But for most people, political engagement is something they have to do in their spare time, their residual time, which isn't a lot for people. People are busy with their job and their family. So my recommendation is plan to carve out some time and dedicate some time to it. You might say, like, I'm going to do, a couple of nights, I might do a couple of hours and then do, a couple of hours on the weekend. And so in the course of planning your month, you think about, okay, I'm going to devote some time, perhaps some writing, some reading, some communicating, some lobbying, visiting people. So, but you will have to be deliberate about it, or otherwise, life will swamp you. So be intentional, and it's kind of a blokesy thing about, living in compartments, but I think it's a little bit of that as well.
Thank you.
Please. Wendy will have a different perspective.
All of you are probably on the ACL email list. That's why you're here. But if you're not, get on that, because when you get that email, we make it really easy for you to have political engagement. And sometimes you just need a help to get started. And I certainly did. 15 years ago I did. But I will, like at the moment I'm running a petition in Queensland we send out an email and everybody in Queensland can sign the petition. That's political engagement. That's the start of political engagement, and that takes probably less than 2 minutes. So the ACL email is one that you should open and not just put straight into the junk file. Open it, just see if there's anything that strikes, oh, Lord, the Lord really wants me to participate in this, and we do make it really easy.
Also, recently I discovered through friends of mine that within each political party, there's factions. And so whoever has the most members of their particular faction has the most power. So one of the things that you can do is join a political party and become part of that faction. So within the Liberal Party, there's left factions, there's right factions, there's conservative factions, there's Christian factions, and you can actually make quite a difference in terms of having a voice and having power to change legislation if you just join your local political party, your local political party.
Sorry, I'm just a bit taken with the whole factionalism in political parties. Just give me a moment. I'll be right. Bindi, you have been very well received today. It's been lovely to hear from you.
Thank you.
And there's a question here which I'd love to hear. Kylie has the most popular question right now with 12 upvotes, and it's for you. Where do you see opportunities for Christians to reclaim the creative arts?
It's a really good question. It's something that clearly I'm thinking about, and I feel like in some areas of the creative arts, Christians have really taken ground, such as in music. There's often a lot of crossover into the mainstream with Christian musicians. However, in the visual arts, you don't see that at all. And it kind of makes me sad because at one point in time, the church was at the forefront of creativity when it comes to visual arts. A part of that was that churches were funding visual arts. And I don't know if they are anymore. And who is funding visual arts is state and national government funding bodies. And they are generally run by people with different values values and politics to Christians who are making art. So I think one good way would be for churches to really get behind visual artists and nurture them and support them. Another thing that I realise is that I feel like God is using me to break ground. So I was fortunate enough to become successful as an artist prior to wholeheartedly walking with Jesus, which meant that I developed a whole set of postmodern art strategies that when I turned to Jesus and gave me back my practice and my platform, I used for him. And so now I'm writing a PhD about that. And I think that something like that is useful. So we just need to slowly infiltrate, allow God to break ground, encourage and support other people in your field. So I'm really keen in meeting with other Christian artists who are trying to make art and break ground as well. And so I just think it's slowly, step by step, allowing God to do things, praying, seeking God for direction, being vocal, getting your church's support, and making good art. You know, I think sometimes we think, for any creatives out there as Christian creatives, sometimes we think that we have to make biblical scenes or abstract paintings, whereas you don't. You just have to be you and tell your story through whatever medium that you have. So don't think that you need to change and subscribe to some particular way of art, but be you, tell your story, take the things that are unique to you, and God can use those.
Just in a very quick question from me. For someone who is a Christian who feels a sense of artistic talent kind of brewing, is it a safe place to go to the modern art institutions of this country for them? What kind of, is it comfortable, or is it quite challenging?
To just visit, do you mean? Or
well, to study,
Oh.
to be exposed to that sort of environment in view of getting to that level of competence.
Yeah. I mean, I think all art schools, all academia is not going to necessarily embrace you if you're a Christian. You know, I'm at Deakin, and I feel like God has specifically put me there. He hasn't put me in a Christian college. He's put me there to do a PhD that's underpinned by Christian ideas. And I've come against all sorts of things. I've been told by supervisors in our PhD summer school that I'm not allowed to use the word Christian. I have to redefine my research, and I would be sitting next to somebody who's Muslim doing Islamic research that they're lauding, and I'm being told I'm not allowed to do these things. But you just have to persevere. And as the Christian, you are called to be set apart, and sometimes that means that you might be the sole person in the secular space doing what you're doing, you know, and that's the cost. And you just have to be strong and be tough and come to things like this and get strengthened and edified, and then go back into the world and do what you're doing.
Yes. All right. I regret, folks, this will have to be the last question for today. Thank you for all your creative input. I apologise to those that we didn't get to. So the last question, and it's potentially one that everybody could contribute to. Non-Christians are marinating in identity politics, says Hingy. If a non-binary person came to church, what steps would a non-progressive church take to reach them? I think this is very much about that balance between truth and love, and how do we embrace and yet be clear about things?
Maybe if we start at this end, then we can work our way down. One of the things that I was trying to draw out in my talk is that people are not an identity. You can be a non-binary person. Well, what does that even mean? Everyone can be a non-binary person, but the thing is that God loves people. God made that person to be unique and special and wonderful because they are them, not because they have put on some sort of identity that they clothe themselves in. And so basically, I think just treating people like an individual person and being interested in them and being loving towards them. Now, if it's issues with the toilet block or whatever, then you can probably find practical ways around that. I used to, the church that I go to now, there was when I joined, there was a woman who sat behind me called Rachel. And over the years, Rachel gradually became less and less attractive and eventually grew a beard and said, oh, look, just call me Lawrence. And And then there was a sort of church party while everyone went and threw out an amazing shoe collection that Rachel had had. But in the meanwhile, what had happened was the pastor had, should Rachel use the women's toilets or not? Well, the pastor just said, look, just use my toilets. And the men just embraced Rachel as, a person. The pastor always refused to call Rachel Rachel, always called him Lawrence. But basically, it wasn't a quick thing, but it was over several years that Lawrence just came to realise that he was loved for who he was and that he didn't need to put on somebody else's identity to be truly loved and accepted. And he wasn't more loved when he was Lawrence than when he was Rachel, so I think just treat people like people and not like identities, and don't try and put them in boxes.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. Having walked into my church maybe 11 years ago as a big mess, I was just loved. And I was never told that I should believe in these politics, and I wasn't condemned for what I was doing, nor was I even really hauled across the coals for the sin that was prevalent in my life. I was just loved as God transformed me as I read the Bible and I prayed. And so I think we just need to trust God to do the transformation or whatever's required as we love each other.
I would just say, sin is sin, and everybody who walks in that door is carrying a burden from outside. And so we don't differentiate between sin, neither does God. And so it is a matter of loving. I don't think then that we immediately try and put that person into leadership or try and accelerate them into creche or looking after. We've got to be really wise. But God loves the sinner, and he hates the sin, but he loves the sinner, and that's what he calls us to do.
Just one thought, which doesn't cover the whole question, but I find we can sometimes get a little bit preoccupied with the surfacey stuff, like rules and how do we interact with this kind of person and all this. And what it does is it makes us cold and it makes us rule followers. And I think we need never to forget that the most powerful thing when we interact with someone, no matter their circumstances, is our motive. There's something much deeper. It's what we want for them. It's the motive to which we're drawn. And what we're called to do is to love them, which effectively means that at whatever cost to self, to serve their highest and best interests. And if we truly desire for them, if we mourn over their situation, as Jesus always mourned over those who were held captive in sinful things and all the rest of it, he wept for them and all that. If we do that and we really desire for them in our heart of hearts, that ultimate blessing, then I think that will actually radiate in our attitude towards them and in all that we say to them. And so that will help, whatever the rules we impose are. But let me read something which I read the other day. We often think that the Bible doesn't have much to say to somebody who's transgender, for example. And it does, because it treats us all as people, as Wendy said. But here's an interesting verse in Isaiah 56. They didn't have transgender people, but they had eunuchs. And it said, let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And that's fulfilled in Acts when Philip preaches to the Ethiopian eunuch, and he's wonderfully converted. So yes, God's arms are extended to transgender people, to non-binary people, to queer people. And if we have that same heart, I think it'll radiate through how we interact with them.